So, Aris, do you like artifacts?
I'm an archaeologist. Of course, I do like artifacts.
Then you are definitely going to love the very following interview with Jack Harrison. So, Jack, according to yourself, you're a resident of sunny Southampton, which is a sunny place, can be a sunny place.
Yeah.
Mostly, yes. You're also a spreadsheet enthusiast. I can kind of relate that probably. But you're most importantly, for purposes today, you're a tabletop game designer. And one of the games that you designed is this very, very neat solo RPG in which you play as an artifact, which is called Artefact, right?
There you go.
Yep. And we played this game a couple of weeks ago. Not a couple, but a few weeks ago. You can catch the video on our YouTube channel, of course. And right now, we're not going to play Artefact, unfortunately. But we're going to talk to Jack about the game. So, welcome, Jack. And we really want to start off this discussion by asking you, how did you come about making this game? Like, what was the initial idea?
Yeah, so I ran a game jam last year. So I don't know if that's a concept that's familiar to you, but
yeah, it's a place where a lot of game developers come together and they just basically jam, right? Like a bunch of musicians with all sorts of creative ideas.
Little games get made.
Yeah.
So I ran one back in, I think it was May last year, and the theme of the jam was legacy. So it was all about time and inheritance and any kind of interpretation of the word legacy. And it got about 2/3 way through the jam, and I realized I probably ought to submit a game for my own jam. Otherwise, it's kind of embarrassing. And so I've been playing. We've been playing in my little regular game group a game by Jason Morningstar called The Skeletons.
Nice. I think that was also a Kickstarter. I think I backed that one even.
I didn't. I've only seen it.
That's another one. That's another one with skeletons in there. Yeah. Sorry. Moving on.
There are a few with skeletons in it. So, so The Skeletons is about a group of skeletons that are cursed to stay within a dungeon, and that's where the kind of structure of the game came from. So you play not as a solo game. You play it with friends, but you play one of these undead guardians of a tomb, and invaders will come to the tomb. And then you'll wait an interminable amount of time, and then more invaders will come, and you kind of learn more about yourself and maybe a bit about the tomb and who's coming to the tomb, that sort of thing. So we just played this game, and I thought I really liked the way that gives you these huge stretches of time. And I kind of was wondering about what else would fit the mold there. And then I had the idea of that was one step from there to thinking, magical items have kind of sentience in the same way as like an undead guardian of a tomb might do, and so that's where the seed of Artefact came from.
That's very interesting. So I was initially kind of surprised when Angus told me, hey, there's this game on Kickstarter about artifacts. I was like, what? So I guess that kind of answers where the idea came from, but why artifacts in particular? What was interesting about making a game about artifacts?
Probably two things. So I think more generally, I've always been really interested in objects and the history of objects, and I guess the archaeology of objects, if that's the right thing to say. But
yes, no, definitely, that is on the money.
Or whatever. Yeah. My wife is actually an archaeologist. So
right, okay.
We've always have enjoyed going to museums and looking at things and reading the stories and that sort of thing. So outside of any kind of fantasy stuff, I think it's really fascinating to look at actual real artifacts in the real world. But then obviously also I'm a massive nerd who likes role-playing games, and I think there's always this idea that you're going to have this amazing magical sword or whatever with a huge history, but invariably nobody really cares about it as much as the GM or whatever who made the item.
Sure, yes.
So if nothing else, I thought, well, Artefact lets you enjoy the process of making that. And then if you do go on to share it with your friends, you've at least had a good time making it, even if they then ignore it and just focus on the fact that it's flaming and can chop off the heads of their enemies or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, there's this legacy in, as you say, in role playing games of magical items. And were there particular artifacts on your mind when you were making this game, either from role playing games or just artifacts from real world history?
I think that in the first iteration, for me, it was all about weapons at first, and then as I kind of spent more time in the scene of developing RPGs, I think there's actually probably quite a few more interesting things and more interesting stories you could tell if it's not focused around always, fighting and killing things. So I included the shield and the instrument in the first edition, but I was really excited with the second edition to go and add a bunch more playbooks to tell all sorts of different stories, some weirder than others. And each of those playbooks comes from often a piece of media, like the ornament. The inspiration for that is definitely the ring from Lord of the Rings.
Ah, yes.
So, yeah. I mean that for me is the sort of is my go-to for pitching the game now, because if you know Lord of the Rings, then you'll know that there's this one item that has this huge history and touches all these different people and is very pivotal in this overall story, but there's lots of little stories going on throughout, and that's the sort of story that I shoot to tell in Artefact, or shoot to produce, let people produce.
Shoot to produce. Oh, nice. That's a neat term. Okay. So it's interesting because we played the ornament when we were playing, and we were playing it all wrong, first of all, but a little bit about that later, maybe. But my go-to thing was these sort of bracelets and necklaces from Melanesia. So that was the thing. I mean, the ring, of course, makes much more sort of popular sense. But my was basically these Kula valuables, sort of the staple of anthropological ethnographic theory. So I think that probably even if you had certain images in mind, people are going to take this to so many different places. So very cool.
That's the best thing of it, right? Is that you bring a little bit of yourself to it, and hopefully it's broad enough to tell those stories.
Yeah, and the same goes, of course, for artifacts from our past. People put little things of themselves into those as well, and now as archaeologists we get to tell their stories. But one of the things that is interesting is that Artefact is a solo RPG. I mean, that was one of the things that sort of stood out to me. Can you explain maybe for our viewers what a solo RPG is, and also why Artefact is a solo RPG?
Okay, so solo, if you know what RPGs are, if that's a given, they're games the way you play as something else. You embody a role of some sort. Traditionally, it's things like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, where you're playing an adventurer, but it could be other things. It could be a science fiction setting or whatever else. A solo RPG, at its broadest term, is, as you might imagine, an RPG that you play by yourself. You probably didn't need me to tell you that.
No.
But broadly, they fall into two categories super categories, and those are games that try to emulate the traditional RPG experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons with a whole load of dice, and they kind of try to automate the actions of other players so that you feel like you're playing with other people. Or get games that are specifically made for yourself, and they're often, sometimes they're called journaling games, because you tend to do a lot of writing, and weirdly the writing that you're doing kind of becomes an artifact in itself, which I always feel cheesy when I use that, because that's obviously the name of the game. But I think artifacts of play are really a kind of a really interesting part of the whole scene as well.
Yes,
it's just difficult to talk about it because that's also the name of the game.
Yes.
So, as you know, because you've played it, Artefact is more of a journaling game. So there's no real stats. You're not rolling dice. You're just making decisions and choosing prompts and following the flow of the game to try and tell an interesting story. And I find that really interesting. So, as to why Artefact is a solo RPG, that is because I wrote it in the very depths of early parenthood, when I couldn't see anyone really. I couldn't hang out in an evening because my child was busy screaming the house down or waking
Sure.
up every 5 minutes. So
Yeah.
the idea of having something I could play in my own time was appealing. There you go.
Nice. Is there also something? I mean, maybe this wasn't part of the conception of the game, but is there maybe also something to read the bond that people have, the solo and unique bonds that people have with stuff in the world, artifacts or just tidbits, little items that we have, right? Because we form strong connections there. Is there something there as well, or what do you think?
It's definitely, I think it's one of those things where what I described to you is where it started, and then as it developed and as I revised it for the second edition, a lot of the feedback was about how kind of contemplative it was, and how you kind of develop a bond with the item over the course of the playthrough. Some people get very upset at the end if you play through and your item starts to, diminish or disintegrate or whatever. So there is definitely this sort of softer, more intimate one-on-one relationship that you get by playing that you maybe wouldn't get if you were playing it with other people.
Yeah.
So.
Very neat.
So this is a very solo RPGs is generally a quite unique and interesting concept. I mean, there are other board games that have solo versions, but they are often just more enjoyable with others. But Artefact is particularly enjoyable if you play it by yourself. But we checked some of your other games, and they are all of them have these kind of small, contained but very story-driven experiences. So how did you get interested in developing this kind of story-driven games?
I think I'm in a way responding to the scene that I'm part of. So I only actually started making tabletop games a year and a half ago. I made video games before. I tried to design board games and submitted my friends to terrible prototypes, and they didn't work very well. And it was only at the beginning of 2019 that I discovered the itch.io, which is the website that I primarily sell and kind of promote my stuff through. And itch has this amazing scene of indie designers. I think because the barriers to entry are so low, there's just been this explosion of people going from an idea to producing a PDF or whatever to getting it up there and giving it away or making money from it really, really quickly. And that wasn't really possible until quite recently. So, and that scene that I consider myself part of, although it's always a bit nebulous, has this focus on, okay, if you want to be an adventurer and go on quests, you're probably off playing Dungeons and Dragons already. So rather than go for that, let's go for something more focused. And if somebody thinks, oh, it would be cool to make an item, then nobody else is doing that. Very few people are doing that. It's a much easier place to make a mark by doing something a bit more unique and small and contained.
And do you have any other background on game development, or is it kind of a hobby that elevated into?
Yeah, it's definitely a hobby.
But you started out as a video game developer, you say?
Yeah. So, but again, game jams. But I think because I do a lot with computers and coding in my day job, now that my time is so constrained, doing that in my spare time was not so much fun anymore. So, dealing with bugs all of the time is not much fun. So, so I think writing has become much more of a passion now.
We often forget that even that particularly sort of tabletop RPGs or just board game like experiences that are small and simple are easier to produce, and you can still put so much creativity in there, right, by yourself. So you can more or less say the thing that you wanted to say with your game with an RPG as well. And there's now, as you say, a huge market for it on itch.io. Well, there's not a huge market, not like Hollywood movie style market, but there's a good marketplace, a very good marketplace, and just a lot of people that are now branching beyond the standard board games and the more standard RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, and are really looking for these complementary sometimes, but also otherwise just outstanding experiences. So that's also how I, for example, found this book on Kickstarter, right? What was that like, the Kickstarter experience?
Pretty insane.
Yes.
I was concerned about whether the project would fund at all. That's my first thing. I am not a celebrity, unfortunately. Well, I don't know. But so yeah, I had some serious concerns about whether it was going to work at all. But it blew up, and I went to bed, woke up the next day, and it had already blown past its target, and it just kept going up and up and up, and I was blown away. So yes, we've been stuck in box hell since sort of May, with just boxes and boxes of zines taking up every part of our house to send out.
That's the flip side of the success, of course. You also have to.
It's a good problem to have.
It's a luxury problem at that point.
Yeah, for sure. So you said you saw parts of our live stream that we did a couple of weeks ago, and we of course ended up talking a lot about things that archaeologists end up talking about, like agency of objects and animated things, but then more from the theoretical point of view. And I think I was wondering. So you already talked about this a little bit, but how critical was it for the design of the game that these objects, these artifacts that you can play, are in fact intelligent and magical things? Could they also have been something else than intelligent and magical, or do you think that was really sort of the critical part of it?
As opposed to, I guess the question is.
Well, the question is, so I mean, you could think of a game in which the fact that these artifacts,
whether they're magical or not.
I mean, they're magical, but also particularly, intelligent and magical, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's of course the legacy that comes from role-playing games. Artifacts are items that have awareness and intelligence, or the real good ones, right? The real big ones. But I mean, they don't tend to have that, or at least we don't tend to conceive of artifacts or objects really as that, but we still have all sorts of things. So I wonder, for you, in terms of the game design, how critical it is that they have this particular...
I think because you're once you start playing the game, you are embodying the item, so you're writing from it, and you're kind of thinking from its perspective. That would have been possible if it was just a hunk of metal or whatever. But I think it is, for me anyway, it was easier to get into that mindset by thinking of this thing as something that has an intelligence and a degree of will, or sort of free choice or whatever about what it does or what it doesn't do. So yeah, that was it's an interesting point, because there's other ideas that I have that would use a similar framework, but they don't necessarily have a sentient thing at the core. And it's interesting to think about how that would change the game if you're writing from the perspective of a more, hunk of metal or whatever.
Yeah. And I think that was like quite critical. Also in our discussion as well. Like it's one thing to tell the story of, I don't know, a bastard sword +1 or something that you play in D&D and has a legacy by itself, but then you just write the story of the object. But in this case, you're not only like you're doing something as an object. It's not only the story of the object, but it's the fact that the object can't do things by itself, which is maybe something we don't think about for our everyday objects.
No.
Right.
Yeah, but also critically that it can't do everything. So it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
It can't just go off and live its own life. It is reliant on its keeper to kind of help it do things or not, and rest and sit in a ditch for 1,000 years or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing that was kind of critical, I think, in the game, the keepers, and how like open-ended they were on one. Like they had some descriptive questions, but then you could really open it up if you wanted to. So how did you go about designing these keepers, like these choices? Or
it's really hard. I mean, with a lot of the games of this kind, shorter, mainly kind of prompt driven. It's really important to get that stuff right, because it's kind of all there is. And it takes a lot of iterations to find that balance between offering enough freedom so that people can tell the story they want to tell, but without leaving someone so open that they feel totally bereft of ideas. And if you just say they pick it up, someone picks it up and they do something with it, then it's like, what, who? It's really difficult to create a whole story from nothing. But similarly, if you say, this person does this specific thing with it, and that happens every time in that story, you would never pick that one again because you will have done that once. I'm not going to do that again. So I guess in terms of how I did it, it's just a lot of writing the same thing over and over again and changing one word back and forth and thinking about it and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Nice.
And playtesting. So one of the best things about being so successful on Kickstarter was that there was loads of people happy to playtest the game and provide feedback on it, and that was really crucial to fine-tuning all those prompts and that sort of thing.
Yeah, playtesting is always key, also like in my opinion, on game design. But the setting that you've set up is, as we discussed, it's lies more on the fantasy side of things, right? What would you think if people would pick up the game and start designing their own keepers or their own artifacts, or like new settings? Maybe instead of fantasy, have like a historical setting or a more like real setting. Is that something that you would be okay with, this idea? People like sort of modding your game?
I'd love it. Yeah, I'd love to do a like an SRD, a system reference document. It's often called for. The main reason I wouldn't is because it's not really my idea, my core system to begin with. It's Jason Morningstar's and then Politopoulos. So the skeleton is the kind of progenitor of this game. So for me to come out and say, "Here's my system reference document," would be a bit funny. But also, I wouldn't stop anybody, or I would encourage anybody to take the framework and run with it, definitely, because I think I've got a bunch of ideas, but I'd love to see what other people do with it as well. Definitely.
So do you have any tips or like some suggestions if somebody wants to design their own keeper or like their own artifact and on what to do?
I mean, it depends on how different and from the base thing you want to go. I think all of my games pretty much have been hacks or amalgamations of other game systems, because I'm new to this. It's a good way to start, to pick some existing thing that works and use that as a framework to build something around. And I think, unlike some other scenes, the tabletop RPG scene is really into that idea. Nobody says, "Hey, that's my idea." As long as you accredit somebody in your document, people love the idea of this building on other people's work. So in general, the way I try to deconstruct a system that I like to figure out what I want to take into a different game, you've got to kind of really play it a bunch, understand what are the active parts of that game. So in my game, it's you've got the keepers, you've got the playbooks, and you've got the rest periods. And those kind of the three main mechanics of the game. That's quite relatively simple. Other games are obviously much more complex, but once you take those parts, you can then take all of the sort of system game-specific language off those. So instead of saying keepers, you can maybe that still makes sense, but you can call them generic things and see how they map over to your idea. And maybe you only take a couple of them and you leave one at the side and replace it with something different. But really understanding what the skeleton of that game is.
I do love. I wouldn't switch out the idea of the keeper, or the concept of the keeper, and even the name of it. But I mean also the name of it, because I think it's an excellent way of talking about people that keep artifacts, that care for artifacts, right? And in that sense, I think there were lots of little things in this game that made me actively think about my own profession or my own background as an archaeologist. And we even talked in our stream about that it would be pretty neat if archaeology students would sort of train with things, because that's what archaeologists do, right? We tell stories with objects, and we train with this particular game. And I thought you had a bit of an interest in teaching anyway, I think, because I saw a game on your itch.io called Tutelage, which is about teachers, maybe not the best kind of teachers, but teachers, right? So do you have any ideas on using tabletop RPGs in maybe in general, but Artefact maybe in particular for education, for training purposes?
I mean, so I've seen it used a fair bit for general creative writing, which is obviously a really good application of the game, because it fits that very easily. As to more specific things, I guess, it is that historical long time view angle of archaeology that has the best fit there. It's how you think about, I guess. So what I love to see is the final image of an artifact from the game, because if you've been playing it, if you played a full thing and you've had a bunch of keepers, then there'll be all these marks and things on it that I think invite questions as to where did they come from and why is that like that? Why is that thing broken and reforged or replaced with a part of whatever? And that's looking at that thing as it is, and then going sort of backwards through the game to look at the different keepers and stuff like that is really fascinating. I did actually think about having it in that order at one point, but it was too much of a mess to design, and with drawing it becomes very complicated as well because you're removing things, which is never easier. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept to think about things in that direction as well.
Neat.
So we're, of course, always on the lookout for new cool RPGs to play, and seeing as you are both a creator but also within that scene, do you have anything that you would like particularly recommend in general or specifically to us as archaeologists?
I mean, there's so much out there, as I'm sure you're aware. There's stuff's coming out all the time. I would hazard a guess that if you had anything you wanted to do within the world of RPGs, there's probably someone that's made a weird little game that does it at this point. But there's definitely, in terms of another solo RPG that inspired Artefact, just in terms of what you could do, the fact that solo RPGs existed, and itch.io and stuff like that. So there's a game called Alone in the Ancient City by Takuma Okada. And that's one of the first games I played in this scene. And it's a game of someone discovering a very old city. And you play it using a deck of cards. So you draw a card, and that relates to sort of how you find the thing and what it is. So you come across a big set of gates or whatever, and then you go through and there's a market. And that's really fun. So and it's another journaling game where but you get to sort of live through this city and discover it through their eyes. So that's definitely top tier.
That sounds.
But I could recommend 100, but that would take away too much.
Sure. No, but Alone in the Ancient City, that sounds like an RPG up your alley, Aris. Because,
absolutely. Sounds exactly like
your PhD is all about ancient cities, so there you go. So, and aside from that, of course, people watching now should most definitely also play Artefact. I think they'll, even if you, I'm gonna say that even if you've never played an RPG before, this is a good entry point. If you're an archaeologist in particular, but just in general, I would say, because it's a really, if you commit to it, it's a very easy playing game. And there's just a lot of creativity and relaxation, I would say, as well. There's a lot of relaxation to be getting it from. And aside from Artefact, of course, play the rest of Jack's games, which down at the bottom somewhere over there should be a link to your itch.io website, mouseholepress.itch.io. That's where people can find your games, right? Where if they want to reach out to you after seeing this, or just in general, where can they find you? Where's the best way to get in touch with you?
Twitter. So I'm at Mousehole Press.
At Mousehole Press.
But I'd love to hear any stories about Artefact. It's always really energizing to hear people's stories.
Nice. All right. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk with us, and we'll definitely send students with stories your way.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.